Joseph Biden, the President of the United States of America, has visited us in Kiev today to meet our President Volodymyr Zelensky. Usual Monday and usual good afternoon for you, dear world. Me, Henry Keane, and our great team on UATV explaining hard things in easy terms directly from Ukraine. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Biden's visit to Kiev was unprecedented in modern times, on the grounds that it was the first time a U.S. president had visited the capital of the country at war, where the United States military does not control the critical infrastructure. That, White House officials are saying, is the distinction between the trip and previous presidential visits to Afghanistan and Iraq. In those countries, there was a massive U.S. military presence, but there is none in Ukraine, and a minimal diplomatic presence too.
That required a security operational logistic effort from professionals across the U.S. government to take what was an inherently risky undertaking and make it at a manageable level of risk. Jake Sullivan, the United States National Security Advisor to President.
White House officials said that Biden finally gave the go-ahead for the trip on Friday after receiving a final security briefing. It was a great risk, and Biden took it. So what's next? You know, I just will offer you now something that explains it all the best way possible. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Russian propaganda channels.
The senile grandfather Bidon Biden came to Hochland even though he has an ecological catastrophe on the level of Chernobyl unfolded in Ohio. It clearly shows priorities. The drug pig Zeleboba Zelensky is much more important to him than his own citizens. Grandfather Bidon came to Zeleboba, a harlot drug addict in the Russia city of Kiev, occupied by Ukrainezes, probably brought some cocaine. By the way, especially for their white master, the Hochlund, the Ukrainians, turned on the air raid signal in Dik Kiev. This is included in the program for every master who deigns to come to the Big Reich, Ukraine.
There is no need to explain that Biden has made this unannounced visit to Ukraine on Monday to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky in a defiant display of Western solidarity with the country still fighting Russian brutal and unjust invasion days before the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. 1 year later, Kiev stands, Biden declared after meeting with Zelensky at Mariinsky Palace. Jamming his finger for emphasis on his podium flanked by United States and Ukrainian flags, he continued.
Kiev stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you.
Biden spent more than 5 hours in the Ukrainian capital, consulting with Zelensky on next steps, honoring the country's fallen soldiers, and meeting with U.S. embassy staff in the war-torn country. This visit comes at a crucial moment. Biden is trying to keep allies unified in their support for Ukraine as the war is expected to intensify with spring offensives. Zelensky is pressing allies to speed up delivery of promised weapon systems and calling on the West to provide fighter jets, something that Biden has previously declined to do. However, the United States president got a taste of the terror that Ukrainians have lived with for close to a year today. And this is all thanks to you, Comrade Putin. Slava Ukraini. In November 2013, a wave of large-scale protests known as Euromaidan began in response to President Yanukovych's sudden decision not to sign a political association and free trade agreement with the European Union, instead choosing closer ties to Russia. Earlier that year, 2013, the Ukrainian parliament had overwhelmingly approved finalizing the agreement with the European Union. Russia had put pressure on Ukraine to reject it. The scope of the protest widened, with calls for the resignation of Yanukovych and the Azarov government. Protesters opposed what they saw as widespread government corruption and abuse of power, the influence of oligarchs, police brutality, and human rights violations. Repressive anti-protest laws fueled further anger. A large barricaded protest camp occupied Independence Square in central Kiev throughout the Maidan uprising in January and February 2014. Clashes in Kiev between protesters and Berkut Special Right police resulted in the death of 108 protesters and 13 police officers and the wounding of many others. On 21st February, Yanukovych and the parliamentary opposition signed an agreement to bring about an interim unity government, constitutional reforms and early elections. Police abandoned central Kiev that afternoon and the protesters took control. Yanukovych fled the city that very evening. The next day, 22nd February, the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove Yanukovych from the office by 320 votes to 0. Of course, Russia condemned the events as a coup. Pro-Russian counter-revolutionary protests erupted in southern and eastern Ukraine. Russia occupied and then annexed Crimea. Armed pro-Russian separatists seized government buildings and proclaimed the independent states of Donetsk and Lugansk, sparking the Donbas War. You know, all that is to the question, can someone in Ukraine, like Putin did that in Russia, just change the will of his own nation by disregarding it or just adopting the constitution to his own needs? In Ukraine, the revolution ignites. In Russia, nothing happens. Well, you probably can't disregard the political will of a nation if there is nothing to disregard. There is no political will in Russia. That is why Putin has chosen to follow his own. Not a chance in Ukraine. Since the autumn of 2022, preparations have begun in the Kremlin for the presidential elections 2024, which are planned practically as referendum. The plan is to nominate representatives of parliamentary parties as Putin's sparring partners. Liberal candidates are not included, of course. The question of participation of a representative or representatives or turbo-patriots, right-wing nationalist forces that have increased their influence enormously in the times of Putin's criminal warfare against Ukraine and who, among other things, criticize the authorities, remains open. Why? Putin is afraid of even his own raised mad dogs. Because the base idea of whole Putin's company and the essence of his reign, just by the way, is the ideology of unity.
And we, the victims of aggression as martyrs, will go to heaven, while they will just die because they will not even have time to repent.
The Russian Federation election cycle 2023-2026 looks like as a Resource UA Future puts it, consolidation of the morally and physically outdated regime instead of the discussion about the future. If you are Russian, you need no discussion. You belong to the Kremlin forever and for whatever happens. And if not, the Tsar can always amend the constitution.
Поправки вступают в силу.
The citizens of Russia have made their choice, and in accordance with this decision, I signed the decree on the official publication of the Constitution as amended. The amendments take effect. They enter without any exaggerations at the will of the people. You know my position. The changes made to the country's basic law affects everyone, and only the citizens of Russia could have the final say here.
Right. So, what then? Well, that might look like a secret to you, dear world, but no worries. You have us to explain it all in easy terms. There is no next. We are observing the end and demise of Soviet empire in Putin's or his Tweedledum and Tweedledee. It is obvious that all the Kremlin wants is to strengthen the regime of Putin's personal power as much as possible. The idea of a transit of power has been completely disregarded, as well as the objective necessity of creating an image of the any other but Putin's future for Russia is completely ignored. The bet is on the guaranteed preservation of the regime until Putin's physical death. We will be seeing happy crowds of poor Russians walking the streets with the photos of their last dictator and shouting out his name. Trust me, we will be seeing the entire election agenda will be built around the Ukrainian theme. At the same time, the goals of the war in Ukraine are not just being kept secret by the Kremlin. No, the Kremlin doesn't know them. They are simply non-existent. So, as usual for oligarchic and autocratic regimes, the situational needs and interests of the authorities will be articulated as goals. In the meantime, the Russian government will try to split the Ukrainian elites, which it perceives as controlled by Zelensky and dependent on the West. Medvedchuk, Kozak, and possibly Surkov, let me explain later who these people are taking on this task. The Kremlin is once again making a mistake in defining its counterparty in Ukraine. These are not elites and not the Western curators, but we, the people. We, the people of Ukraine, the Ukrainian society, the nation, for God's sake, the people, sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, families of Ukraine, molded in just one absolute obligatory necessity: to drive you, Russian Tsar, and your army of murderers away from our land, or drive you 6 feet under it. That is a fine option just as well for us. And guess who's going to help us in Ukraine to ruin Putin's plan on splitting Zelensky elites? Meet Putin's best friend. Viktor Medvedchuk is a former Ukrainian lawyer, business oligarch, and politician who has lived in exile in Russia since September 2022. Medvedchuk is a pro-Kremlin Ukrainian politician and a personal friend of Russian President Vladimir Putin. So, once again, this hard for any logical thinking nutshell will be split to you, dear world, in easy terms. Yes, Putin is going to ask his personal friend oligarch to implement the project of this so-called fifth column, just like this old friend already did in 2014. And here is what happened out of it. Two things at least are obvious. First, Putin has failed once to split the Ukraine even before the war. Now, these days, when he himself, the Tsar, the dictator, the ruler of Russia, has molded us and as a nation into unprecedented, united force, a real one and not Russian one, when in every our city, on every corner, we all are ready to celebrate Putin's army invasion warm-heartedly with Molotov cocktails. I just want to see him trying once again. And second thing, Putin is going to win all his elections in Russia because he owns the country. It's his Russia LLC, limited liability company. And the next parliamentary elections in 2026 should become the final touch in the formation of Putin's regime of lifelong power. Only loyal political projects will be allowed to participate in the elections. The utilization of opposition voices and or dissatisfied voices is planned to be carried out through parties that are nominally oppositional, but in fact are part of the regime, like the Communist Party of Russia, for example. So, as UI Future Resource quite wittingly puts it, the election in 2023 is sandbox in the Department of Political Gerontology. The unified voting day of 2023 is going to be the most important event in the implementation of the Kremlin's plans to extend the existence of Putin's regime for the period of Putin's physical life. And so now, Putin is using 7 meters long tables to avoid any collision with reality, so not to be infected by anything, including the understanding that he is avoiding reality. Well, what's to explain here? Tsar is afraid. You can't possibly do unjust, terrible things, start a war, kill tens of thousands of people, threaten the world with a nuclear scourge, call Russian fascist patriots and the other sick way around to morbidly cling to power with your senile hands, to hate everything Western and at the same time use everything Western around you and just not to be afraid. Of course he is afraid. I mean, the whole world is against him. That means Putin may win his domestic elections, while Ukraine will win the war. It was we, Ukraine, UATV channel, me, Henry Keane, in this very studio. We wish you to be safe and tuned for more. See you soon.